chair may declare a recess at any time. The hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Normally, the Modernization Subcommittee holds its hearings in a roundtable format. Excuse me. But because so many of our colleagues have expressed an interest in joining today, we have moved up to the dais to make sure that there is enough room for everyone. I want to start by saying, even though we are seated up here on the dais, we will stick with our usual discussion-oriented format to encourage more cohesive exchange of ideas and thoughts. Today's hearing is about an incredibly important issue that most of us have avoided talking about. And there are good reasons for that. None of us want to think about disasters or catastrophic attacks, much less imagine ourselves as targets. Anyone who has written a will knows that planning for the future that does not include you is a very tough exercise. When it comes to Congress, we tend to take comfort in the fact that the institution has survived for over 200 years, despite a civil war, 2 devastating pandemics, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and countless other threats. It's easy to assume that if Congress has lasted this long, the chances are it will continue to endure. But as members of Congress, we have a responsibility to examine and discuss these issues to make sure that we are not leaving things to chance. Last Wednesday was the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, and today we'll look at the steps Congress took following the 9/11 attacks. Back then, Congress faced the extremely difficult task of addressing the question of continuity right on the heels of an unforeseen and devastating attack. The solutions they landed on were a thoughtful, good faith effort to thread a very complicated political and procedural needle. As we all know, the threat environment has changed significantly since 9/11, and the margins between parties have become increasingly narrow. These and other factors suggest a need to discuss and better understand the actions Congress took after 9/11 to ensure they adequately protect Congress today. Ranking Member Kilmer has spent a lot of time studying the issue and knows it better than most. I want to thank him for the work he's done to raise awareness and to encourage the subcommittee on holding this hearing. I think it is safe to say that most members care deeply about the issue and that we'd all benefit from re-examining what's changed since 9/11 and thinking through how to address the vulnerabilities that remain. And so I view this hearing as an opportunity to learn. There are different approaches to addressing the challenge of continuity, a constitutional amendment being one of them. But as we all know, passing an amendment is a heavy lift that can take years and sometimes decades. According to CRS, 40 constitutional amendments on the subject of continuity have been introduced since 1945, and none of them have passed. This track record, in part, explains why Congress landed where it did after 9/11. Given the very real challenges of passing an amendment, they opted to find another path forward. This isn't to say that we shouldn't consider it, but I think it makes sense to also consider what we can do in the near term to help safeguard continuity. I'm looking forward to learning more about some of those options today. The bottom line is that everyone's tolerance for risk is different, and that's a big factor in whether and how we plan for the unthinkable. But when it comes to planning for the unthinkable, where Congress is concerned, we should be guided by our obligation to act in the best interest of the American people. In other words, our focus should be on Congress, not on ourselves as members of Congress. Our role in this exercise is to ensure that the institution is capable of carrying out its constitutional obligations, no matter the circumstances. This is particularly important because Congress was created to speak for the American people. Article 1 of the Constitution establishes that the legislative branch is first among the co-equal branches for this very reason. If disaster strikes and Congress is unprepared, we should expect that the executive branch will step in to fill the void. This would leave our constituents without a direct voice in government in a time of crisis. And while that's not a scenario any of us want to imagine, It's one that deserves thoughtful consideration, and I hope this hearing today serves that purpose. At this time, I would like to recognize the ranking member for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
All right. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for hosting this hearing, and for our colleagues both on the Modernization Subcommittee and some who may be joining us from off of it. I appreciate their participation. I also want to extend my sincere appreciation to all of our witnesses for taking the time to prepare and to join us for today. In this role, I often ask my constituents, what keeps you up at night? And there's plenty as members that can keep us up at night, but one that certainly keeps me up at night is political violence and Congress's vulnerability to it. We explored this issue previously when I chaired the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, but we did not finish the job on this topic. And part of our job is to think about the unthinkable. I want you to imagine another shooting at a congressional baseball game practice, or a bomb at the State of the Union, or a party retreat, or even if a plane goes down carrying a full state's delegation to a funeral. I know this is not a fun topic, but I also know that it is increasingly a necessary topic. Just this past weekend, we experienced yet another credible attempt on former President Trump's life following the assassination attempt targeting him just a mere month ago. Last year, we learned that the U.S. Capitol Police tracked a 300% increase in threats against members of Congress over the past 7 years. The White House and the Senate have continuity plans. They are prepared because the Constitution was twice amended to ensure governing can continue if the president or senators are killed or otherwise die while in office, as much as we pray that doesn't happen. But prayer is not a good strategy for continuity. The U.S. House of Representatives is not prepared. Today, we will learn more about how the House would function if a tragic event of this kind were to happen. In a nutshell, it wouldn't. I am grateful to my colleague and friend, Congressman Brad Wenstrup, for serving on our first panel today. He has unfortunately had to think about this issue more than most. As many of you know, Brad was at the 2017 Congressional baseball game practice where a politically motivated gunman shot 4 people, including our colleague Majority Leader Steve Scalise. A trained doctor, Brad rendered heroic medical assistance that day, and I want to thank you for your leadership that day and for being here to share a member's perspective on this important topic. On our second panel, we'll hear from former House parliamentarian Tom Wickham. Tom was here during 9/11, where Flight 93 was headed for the United States Capitol, thwarted by the heroic actions of those aboard. That was the last time the House adopted continuity measures, which included a quorum change and a requirement that states hold expeditious special elections within 49 days following a mass casualty event. Many election officials have indicated they would struggle to meet the 49-day requirement, a sentiment we heard echoed again last week at the elections hearing by our full committee. And in the event of many members of Congress losing their lives, even 49 days is a really long time to have Americans without representation. We'll hear from Ms. Rebecca Gambler with the GAO, who has been leading a related report as a result of a bipartisan request letter from our committee and can speak to this aspect in greater detail. Finally, I want to thank Eric Petersen with the Congressional Research Service for being here today, especially because he has been under the weather. Eric has near encyclopedic knowledge of the history of continuity efforts, of our vulnerabilities as an institution, and the various approaches to address this, and their pros and cons dating from the atomic era into the modern era. And this hearing would have been incomplete without you, sir. I'm glad you're here. I am convinced that there are both constitutional and operational insufficiencies with the status quo. The status quo also creates a perverse incentive for political violence through targeted killings designed to switch the majority party in the House. This vulnerability is especially acute in the narrow majority margins we've seen in recent years. 8 years ago, there were 24 members of Congress at the baseball practice. 24 is more than double the number needed to change the current majority composition of the U.S. House. The Select Committee previously made an open recommendation to establish a joint committee to review House and Senate rules and other matters assuring continuing representation and congressional operations for the American people. There are some who believe that this issue needs more study. Personally, I don't think that. If that's the best we can do, let's at least do that, though. As most of you know, I've introduced, along with Congressman Wenstrup, a bipartisan constitutional amendment to ensure the continuity of Congress. The amendment would require that House members submit a list of 5 potential replacements when they are sworn in, one of whom would be appointed by the state's governor if a sitting member dies or is killed during their term, to then serve temporarily just until a special election can be held. I want to thank Brad and my former co-chair of the Select Committee, current co-chair of the Fixed Congress Caucus, William Timmons, who I think will be joining us today, and Select Committee alum Emmanuel Cleaver for their participation on this effort. Our amendment addresses 2 critical concerns. One, it ensures the continuity of the legislative branch during times of unprecedented crisis. If, God forbid, we saw a mass casualty event, it would be a national crisis. That would be a terrible time to see prolonged vacancies in the House. It would be a time when the House would have to act. And in our proposal, you would have temporary replacements who could do that. And second, our amendment reduces the incentive for political violence, as temporary replacements would likely come from the same party as the original representative. If Congress fails to enact a sufficient continuity plan, the American people will be left wondering why in the world's leading democracy there was no plan to protect our most sacred democratic institutions. Now, just a few days after the 23rd anniversary of September 11th, and now in the face of increasing threats on members ourselves, I am glad we are holding this hearing together and look forward to a productive discussion. My hope is through our work today, we can better protect the U.S. House of Representatives against unspeakable threats and ensure the continuity of this great American experiment. And thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And at this time, I recognize the ranking member of the full Committee on House Administration, Mr. Morelli, for opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like you, I want to thank my colleague and dear friend on our subcommittee, ranking member Derek Kilmer, for his work, his leadership on the important topic, continuity, and thank our witnesses, certainly Representative Wenstrup and all the folks that Mr. Kilmer identified. Thanks. I know imagining disaster scenarios targeting our colleagues and ourselves is hard. Bombs at the State of the Union or party conventions, assassins targeting just enough members of the majority party to put them in the minority. And yet, I think all of us, and certainly as the ranking member of this committee, that is intended to ensure that the House operates. I know we need to be prepared to ensure this Congress, our democracy, can function in the face of all the disasters we prefer not to think about. But right now, vacancies in Congress, as everyone knows, under the Constitution are filled through special elections. It is one of the remarkable things about the history of this House that everybody who has ever served in the House of Representatives owes that seat to an election by the people in their district. Obviously, this would create some changes, which makes it somewhat challenging to think about it. But the notion of mass casualty events or disasters led several bipartisan members of this committee to write a letter to the Government Accountability Office requesting they examine how quickly states will be able to hold special elections following a mass casualty event. And as Ranking Member Kilmer suggested, some local election officials have real concerns about how quickly they can do all this. I think the full committee also voted unanimously for an amendment earlier this Congress directing the study that was talked about. And I think that's a positive bipartisan step to become better informed about the topic and to raise the specter of what we do. As I understand, the previous Select Committee made a related recommendation to establish a joint committee of members to ensure continuity in the face of the next potentially unforeseen crisis, modeled after prior legislation that was never enacted. So the convening today is really important, and I want to again thank the committee sub-chair, or the subcommittee chair, for bringing us together and to think about this and to force us to really sort of spend some time. So I look forward to discussion of the bipartisan constitutional amendment, HJ Res 118, as well as one of the possible ways of addressing it. Ensuring we get this right matters for a whole host of reasons. We need to maintain an uninterrupted legislative capacity during times of crisis, as my friend Mr. Kilmer has talked about, especially if Congress is needed to address funding bills, to war authorizations, or other emergency legislation that we would need to respond to a crisis. The Constitution establishes the balance of power between the 3 branches. It's hard to imagine our government functioning with one of those 3 branches incapacitated. And so all of this, I think, and all Americans deserve representation as quickly as possible, even in emergency situations. It is a tough topic. It's also one that I suspect our founders would never have really seriously considered in their day and age, but it's one that in the modern era we do have to consider as distasteful as it is. So, and I think we can make important strides, and I think this conversation is certainly a way to do that. And again, want to thank Mr. Kilmer for his long commitment to this subject, and to, again, to the chair for bringing us together and continuing a dialogue on an important subject. So thank you all, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And at this time, it is my delight to welcome our colleague, Dr. Brad Wenstrup, who has graciously agreed to join us today to share his experiences and thoughts about the topic of continuity, as he has experienced it firsthand. So with that, Dr. Wenstrup, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Bice, Ranking Member Kilme, the whole House Administration Committee for having me here today to testify and have the discussion, as you described it that way, on the topic of congressional continuity. And I'm really grateful for the serious approach that this committee has taken. And if it takes a committee to appoint a committee to make a study to eventually get something done, let's do it now. Let's do it now, because we have to. And as has been said, it's not a pleasant topic to think about. It's incredibly serious, and it's serious and so important for the country. You know, it's been 7 years since the shooting at the baseball field, and you know, I've thought about this problem for some time, and I brought it up here and there during certain opportunities. So I'm really grateful that this is happening now. This is really important, because not only, as has been mentioned, can we take away the incentive for someone to act in a nefarious way, we're going to preserve the idea that all Americans will have a voice here in Congress, virtually at all times. So I've always thought that out of everything bad that happens, there's a chance to do something good. And I think that that opportunity is here and now. And so again, I'm very grateful for what is being done here by this committee, and that we're taking the time to deliberate and hopefully move forward to find the best response in case the unthinkable ever happens, or the unthinkable that has happened has some success, some negative success. So this isn't just a hypothetical situation we're dealing with today. And, you know, I first came to Congress, you know, since I came here, there's been a real uptick in political violence against fellow Americans, against elected officials, increase in violent political rhetoric from elected and non-elected people in social media. And, you know, let's face it, we always talk about the increase of mental health needs in our country. We have a problem. And someone who may have mental health needs does not need to be incentivized towards taking bad action. So in recent years, we've seen the shooting, Congressman Gabby Giffords, anti-Semitic incidents skyrocket, assassination attempts on President Trump. According to a recent Time article, 1/3 of Americans believe that violent action against the government can be justified. John Lewis, colleague, great American, he used to say good trouble. He didn't have this in mind. This is not what he was talking about. So, you know, June 14th, 2017, I was on the baseball field with my colleagues practicing for the baseball game. A violent domestic terrorist attempted to assassinate Republican members of Congress. He had names in his pocket, descriptions in his pocket. This was a clear assassination attempt. And he decided to use murder or assassination as a tool for political change. He wanted to wipe out the Republican majority and change the balance of power in our Congress. 136 rounds were fired on the field at that confrontation. Sitting members of Congress and their staff were seriously injured and required immediate medical intervention. What would have happened if Capitol Police weren't there? He could have killed sitting members. if he had achieved his goal and there were enough members to tip the balance of power in one direction or another, he succeeded. Let's take that opportunity away. Yeah, he could have killed, if someone is killed or incapacitated beyond the ability to serve, that's a problem. So there's too many what-ifs in a situation like this, because Congress hasn't fully considered the implications of mass casualty event affecting members and the impact it would have on the ability of our Congress to function in a time of need. So I think we need to take some next steps, a process that's a deterrent of a disaster. And I think that we can all stand resolute on this, clearly in a bipartisan fashion. We have plans in place for a president. We have seen that happen in the United States of America. But there is a plan in place for secession, and especially if there's multiple leaders that are killed or incapacitated beyond repair, basically. So I'm really proud to join Representative Kilmer, Timmons, Cleaver in leading a proposed constitutional amendment that would establish a congressional continuity plan by requiring each newly elected member to provide a list of at least 5 individuals who are qualified to serve in the member's place in the event of that member's death during the term, and if they were to pass away, the governor of the state must select a replacement from that list within 10 days. We heard how long it takes for a special election. I'll just finish with this, because I know my time has expired, and I appreciate it. We heard it said, hope is wonderful, but it's not a plan. Prayer is great, but it's not a plan. And I just want people to think about, besides the baseball field and the other events, what would we have done on 9/11/2001 if the 4th plane hit the Capitol? We were in session that day. Now yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Wenstrup, and I want to also take a moment to express gratitude for your heroic efforts on the baseball field that day. There were members of the Republican conference that likely may not be with us today if it were not for the heroic efforts that you provided on the field. So we want to show gratitude for that.
Thank you.
At this time, I will begin by recognizing myself for the purpose of asking a question, and then recognize the ranking member, and then our colleagues who might also have additional questions. Let me begin. In 2018, a chartered train carrying Republican lawmakers collided with a garbage truck in Virginia, killing 1 person. In 2020, the COVID pandemic forced Congress to go virtual. My classmate, Congressman-elect Luke Letlow, the husband of the late Julia Letlow, died from complications before he was actually seated as a member of Congress. How do these events, in addition to more recent events like the recent assassination attempts of President Trump, put continuity in a new light?
Well, you saw so many people with COVID dying, and at first we didn't know who was dying and why they were dying necessarily. We've gradually learned who was more vulnerable than others, but at the same time, we have people here with a lot of different medical conditions and different ages, and we saw with COVID that those were reasons for people to be affected and not necessarily live. We fared fairly well, fortunately, in Congress. But there again, that's another situation where we could find ourselves with a huge, huge absence. The train wreck, I can tell you, being on that as well, where we had a large number of members of the House and Senate, if we had hit that truck in a different way, we would have derailed. We were fortunate we hit the back end of the truck and it went spinning. So again, we lucked out. But if we derailed, who knows how many people might have died. So you have to take all of these things in mind. And not only is it important how we posture ourselves and protect ourselves when we gather and even individually, we have to think of what happens afterwards. And, as I look at the baseball field, if Capitol Police weren't there, Steve Scalise took a bullet for all of us. And because that's the reason Capitol Police were there. If they weren't there, this guy, I'm telling you, walks into this field, he kills 20 to 30 members of Congress and their staff in one morning, changing the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And I would contend that's an insurrection by one person, by one person. And you know what? We try to protect ourselves as best we can, and we've made changes, and we try to increase our security, but bad things happen. And you can have all the security you want, that doesn't stop a pandemic.
Dr. Wenstrup, in my opening statement, I mentioned that there have been 45 proposed constitutional amendments to address the continuity issue, and that none of them have actually been successful. In your opinion, why is a constitutional amendment the sort of only option that you feel like would address this issue?
Well, our founders made constitutional amendments tough for good reason. That it would take the will of a large group of people. I really don't know why all the other opportunities have not come together, but I can't think of a time in history where the continuity of government has been as threatened as it is today. And I think that I would hope that the American people and all members of Congress, Senate, and the White House would have an understanding as to why this needs to take place, and we probably shouldn't dawdle. I consider not having something in place a national security threat.
Thank you for that. I would say the Civil War times may have also been a time where there was certainly concern about continuity given the engagement, but I appreciate your comments there. At this time, I want to I'm going to recognize the ranking member, Kilmer, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I really thank you for being here. I want to thank you for showing up. And you just spoke to two situations that could have been a whole lot worse, right? The train derailment could have flipped the majority in the House for months and months. You mentioned the baseball field, only because Leader Scalise was a member of leadership was Capitol Police even present that day. And but for their presence, that could have been much worse. So I think the perspective you bring to this conversation is really important, and I want to thank you for sharing that. I also want to thank you for co-leading the constitutional amendment, and I just want to give you a little bit of an opportunity to talk about why you decided to sign on to that proposal and what you see the benefits of it as.
Well, as I was reflected on in my opening statement, this concern of mine has been there since the shooting at the baseball field, for sure. And I mention it here for this committee or that committee and just in passing, and I kind of kick myself for not taking action. So I'm extremely grateful to you for coming to me. We know each other, and I think it would mean a lot to me that we take some action here. And as someone who's, I guess we both are retiring from Congress after this term. And so maybe this can be our swan song where we do something good for the sake of the nation, for the sake of this body, and for national security, and to maybe deter bad actors.
Yeah, I know the chairwoman asked you about the choice of pursuing a constitutional amendment. And I think obviously one of the challenges is, we're restricted by the current language of the Constitution to only replace members through election. That automatically runs us into challenges with, and we'll hear from secretaries of state or from the GAO who's talked to secretaries of state, that it just takes time to hold an election, right? You have to have people register as candidates. You have to print ballots. When we talked as a full committee last week, they said, do you want military members to be able to vote? Well, I do, right? And that takes time. And so I'm just curious your take on the benefit of the constitutional amendment approach vis-a-vis other approaches.
Well, one, it really locks it in, and also it shows that it's had very much bipartisan support. But, you know, one of the things I said too is, you know, we have a succession plan for the president, and you go down the secretaries and everything else. They weren't elected either, but they were someone that was selected by the sitting president who was elected. And that's what we're asking to do in the amendment. So I think that was pretty thoughtful, is that the person that was elected is likely choosing someone similar to them, which would be representative of the people that elected the member. So I think that's an important component. And I think that's why it's important to have that list in place. You know, we do it for the speaker, we do it, you know, in other areas too. But what we're doing is saying this is a stopgap. We're not saying you have that seat for the rest of the term or anything else. It's just until the special election goes through its ordinary process. So we constitutionally aren't trying to change the way states operate their elections, but at the same time, we're letting that state or that district have representation.
Thanks so much. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Mr. Carey for 5 minutes for questions.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity, and Doctor. You know, I think Ohioans know your service, and obviously you and Derek both leaving this institution, you know, really shows in a bipartisan way how the institutional knowledge of this body will lose a lot of the institutional knowledge. So I just want to, I appreciate all your years of service and everything that you've done, not just from your time in Congress and your heroic efforts on a baseball field, but your military service and your commitment to take care of your young family, and I do appreciate that. I just want to say, you know, this is an issue, you know, most people see many of us on TV shouting at the rain, but we are a body that can come together in a bipartisan way to get things done. And I think what you see in the subcommittee, and I think what you see in the House Admin Committee, you see that we can work together to deliver solutions to the American public. I just wish that on both sides, our colleagues would recognize that we can get along and we can do the right things for the American public. But I do want to ask you a couple questions. What are your views on the Select Committee's recommendation for the Joint Committee to investigate these issues more fully and make recommendations on what we're doing and what we're speaking about today?
Well, beyond recommendation, I'm pleased that you're doing it, as I've said. I mean, this is fantastic, probably long overdue, but I'm seeing serious conversations about a serious matter coming from both sides of the aisle, and I want you to drive on and keep going with this, that I hope can result in a change in how our laws read, how our Constitution reads, so that we are better able to serve the American people. And you know, we don't want someone to be able to take away the voice of Americans here in this body. You know, we are a democratic republic. We represent the people. They've selected us. And if there's something bad that happens, then someone that we recommend should be able to fill in temporarily until the normal state process can take place.
And I think it's also important to, you know, I came in a special election, and I know the process that it took. We had to have a primary, we had to have a general, so our primary was, I think the congressman that had my seat before resigned, I believe it was the first part of the year, I'm not sure when Steve resigned, but our primary was done in August, and our general was done in November. And so we're able to do those, and I know Ohio isn't that way, but I think nationally we definitely need to do that. And again, I just want to say thank you for being here today, and Madam Chair and Derek, thank you for having this committee. This is an important issue and one that's thoughtful, one that I think we're going to get bipartisan support with. So with that, Madam Chair,
I think you're doing great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Wenstrup, we appreciate your time this afternoon, and with that, we will introduce the second panel of witnesses.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for our second panel of witnesses, our first witness is Eric Petersen. Mr. Petersen is a specialist in American national government in the Government and Finance Division of the Congressional Research Service, where he has worked for 2 decades. Excuse me. In addition to continuity of Congress, excuse me, his research areas include congressional administration and staffing, constituent service management, congressional executive relations, and government contingency planning. Welcome. Our next witness is Tom Wickham. Mr. Wickham is the former House parliamentarian and served as a nonpartisan House official for over 25 years. In leading an office that reviewed every measure that came before the House, Mr. Wickham has command of a broad range of subject matters covering all aspects of government policy. During numerous high-profile legislative events, he counseled speakers of the House, vice presidents, and countless members and senators on their constitutional and statutory authorities. And our final witness is Rebecca Gambler. Ms. Gambler is the Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. In addition to other issues, she leads GAO's work on a range of election issues, including voting equipment and voter registration, and waiting times at polling places. I want to say thank you to our second panel of witnesses for being with us today. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that the green light is on. When you begin to speak, the timer in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. And when the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we would ask that you please kindly wrap up quickly. At this time, I now recognize Mr. Petersen for 5 minutes of opening statements. Can you make sure that your microphone is on?
Oh, red's on? Okay. Is this better?
Much better, thank you.
Chair Bice, Ranking Member Kilmer, members of the subcommittee, with apologies for the audio, thank you for inviting me to testify today on behalf of CRS. The continuity of Congress, the ability of the national legislature to carry out its constitutional and representational roles in the face of a wide variety of potential interruptions of those activities has been a subject of concern for almost 80 years. Particular attention has been given to solutions at the dawn of the atomic age from 1945 to the early 1960s, and again in the years following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Focusing on that latter period, there have been several changes in light of continuity concerns. In my written testimony, there are discussions of House and Senate efforts to enhance existing emergency response capacities, House authority to install an acting Speaker pro tem if the office of Speaker is vacant, and changes to recess and convening authorities in the House and Senate. My oral remarks center on the challenges of member availability. It may be the case that following an incident in which members of Congress are killed, incapacitated, or missing, a delay in seating new members or identifying sitting members who can continue to serve could adversely affect the ability of Congress to carry out its constitutional responsibilities. Excuse me. The rapid identification of members killed, incapacitated, or missing, and the implementation of established procedures to ensure a quorum of members is available in each chamber are linchpins in any effort by either chamber to recover and reconstitute following a mass casualty or other incident affecting members. Where procedures regarding the death of individual members are well established, matters relating to the capacity or availability of a member to serve have been addressed by the House and Senate only on an ad hoc, case-by-case basis. Despite post-9/11 efforts, there remains a perceived lack of widely accepted solutions that are viewed as reliable and sufficient to ensure that the House and Senate can continue to carry out their constitutional responsibilities. This is due in part to competing ideas of the practicality of arrangements to replace House members by special elections following a substantial loss of members, as well as concern about the constitutionality of current House provisional quorum procedures. Some note that a mass death incident would affect House operations more significantly than it would Senate operations, since the House requires election of all its members, while the Senate can appoint senators. 5 states require special elections to fill Senate vacancies, accounting for 10% of its membership, and an incident resulting in substantial incapacitation or disappearance could have similar effects on either chamber. Finally, constitutional proposals offered during the World Cold War and after 9/11 may overemphasize solutions to congressional vacancies while underestimating the challenges of seats where the incumbents may be missing or unable to carry out their duties while still remaining sitting members. A fulsome consideration of policy approaches to address incapacity or disappearance might have the effect of producing incomplete policy, the continued absence of a fulsome policy approach to address incapacity and disappearance issues might have the effect of producing incomplete policy responses. In the event of a substantial number of missing or incapacitated members following an interruption, the House and Senate may be left with no more effective a path to reconstituting their chambers and returning to more normal operations than that which is currently available. To better ensure the continuity of Congress, reconsideration of existing provisions may need to occur. I'm a bit out of time, so I'm just going to skip to the conclusions. It appears without regards to the consideration of the continuity of Congress, existing procedures and processes, as well as proposals to amend the Constitution, may be insufficient to address a mass casualty event affecting members in the House. Moving forward, Congress might consider that replacing members in what undoubtedly would be one of the most trying times for the institution and the Republic could be extraordinarily challenging. Incomplete processes that do not provide a quorum House or that do so through means seen as illegitimate or otherwise suspect by voters or others could delay a routine return to operations and could call any actions of Congress following reconstitution. There's more I'll be happy to get to in the questions. For now, I want to thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Petersen. And at this time, I recognize Mr. Wickham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Tom Wickham, and I served in the Office of the House Parliamentarian from 1995 to 2021, including as parliamentarian from 2012 to 2020. I'm honored to discuss the reflections on the rules changes that occurred following the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the challenges in continuity of government that face the House today. As a retired parliamentarian of the House, I approach this topic not as an advocate or an academic, but instead as a former practitioner, sharing a perspective of an office dedicated to advising and guiding this institution. In terms of this narrow but critical vantage point, there is no better substitute for the guidance of the current parliamentarian of the House, Jason Smith, and that wonderful team as the House seeks to engage on this important topic. The House is fortunate to have a comprehensive history of the House's procedural action in response to 9/11, transcribed in the testimony of George R. Rogers before the Select Committee on Modernization on April 6, 2022, and the 2006 College of William and Mary Law Review article on the provisional quorum rule by John B. Williams. The institutional mindset of the House after 9/11 was focused on preventing and preparing for another terrorist attack, and the institutional offices in the House carried out related operational and legislative activities. These activities range from the assignment of individual rubble whistles, like this one I have right here, the assignment of flashlights, gas masks to members and staff, to mammoth investigative efforts by the 9/11 Commission, and legislative efforts to establish a Department of Homeland Security, which would be the largest government reorganization since the National Security Act of 1947. The central procedural organizing force in the House was the Continuity Task Force, headed by Representative Chris Cox and Representative Martin Frost. Despite the weight of 9/11 and the urgency to ensure continuity and preparation for another attack, the task force was not myopic or rushed and deliberated for 6 months on other historic catastrophic circumstances, including the House's response to the Civil War and to the flu epidemic of 1918. The greatest challenge for that task force was the lack of a procedural foundation from which we could build upon, with very scant procedural tools such as a single statement glued into Jefferson's manual that said that due to the inherent authority of the chair, that a recess could be declared in the event of danger, or a handshake agreement that no members would raise a point of no quorum during an emergency because a quorum would be presumed. With bipartisan spirit driving the task force, it became clear that the most difficult issue was that to deal with the constitutional quorum requirement in the event of a large amount of deaths and incapacitations. The Cox-Frost recommendations were divided, the first submission being the least constitutionally intrusive group of recommendations. This foreshadowed the quorum requirement as a more constitutionally intrusive change that was worthy of greater scrutiny and not the basis of a recommendation from Cox-Frost. What followed was a hearing, a rare hearing of the Committee on Rules with testimony from sitting parliamentarians, one of only 3 occurrences that I can remember, where the issue of the provisional quorum was dived into. And commenting and fast forwarding today in the sake of brevity, the House is fortunate that there is a stronger foundation for action than there was on the days immediately following 9/11. As the House continues looking at this issue to 2025 and beyond, I hope we'll be able to grasp the experience of the pandemic when looking at modern communication abilities, or the decades of experience in the Homeland Security Department when defining catastrophic circumstances. I will wrap up my testimony there and take questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wickham. And finally, we have Rebecca Gambler with the GAO. Ms. Gambler, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bryce, Ranking Member Kilmer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing to discuss preliminary observations from GAO's ongoing work on state capabilities to hold special elections in the event of mass vacancies in the U.S. House of Representatives. All levels of government share responsibility in the U.S. election process, and the election system is highly decentralized. States are responsible for the administration of their own elections, as well as federal elections. States regulate various aspects of elections, including registration procedures, absentee and early voting requirements, and election day procedures. And they support local jurisdictions in administering elections. The process for holding elections includes activities like registering voters, recruiting and training poll workers, selecting polling locations, transmitting absentee and vote-by-mail ballots, and setting up voting machines and voting booths. In 2005, Congress passed a law that addresses holding special elections when the Speaker of the House announces that there are more than 100 vacancies in state representation in the House. In such extraordinary circumstances, the law requires that states in which vacancies exist do several things, including holding a special election within 49 days. Today, I will summarize our preliminary observations on 1, state laws related to holding special elections to fill House vacancies and how they compare with the federal law to hold such elections, and 2, the perspectives of state election officials on the capabilities of and challenges facing states in holding special elections to fill House vacancies. First, our preliminary analysis has identified 9 states that have laws for holding special elections to fill House vacancies that adopt aspects of the federal law for the state, such as those related to the 49-day time frame. Our preliminary analysis also shows that 41 states do not appear to have laws that adopt the federal law for their state. Almost all of these states have provisions in state law that address holding special elections to fill vacancies in their representation in the House. Examples of the types of timing provisions in these laws include specifying the number of days within which states are required to hold the election, or giving the governor discretion to order an election within a specific time frame. Second, we surveyed state election officials in all 50 states to obtain their perspectives on holding special elections consistent with the federal law. As of the beginning of this month, 27 states have responded to the survey. Based on our preliminary analysis of the survey results, 15 of the 27 officials who responded to the survey reported that they were not aware of the federal law prior to hearing about our study. In addition, in responding to our survey, state election officials identified a range of challenges related to holding special elections consistent with the federal law. For example, officials reported that it would be difficult to select candidates within the timeframes required by the law. Officials also noted challenges related to preparing and printing ballots, identifying polling places and poll workers, and transmitting absentee ballots to military and overseas voters. Officials also reported to us that the challenges they identified could affect the accuracy and availability of ballots, pamphlets, and other voting materials, public perceptions of the election, and voting access, such as whether voters have sufficient time to request absentee ballots. However, based on our preliminary analysis, many state election officials reported to us that they believed they could hold a special election consistent with the requirements in the federal law. Additionally, they identified state practices that may help them hold such elections, such as some states assigning responsibility for candidate selection to political parties, which could be done relatively quickly under a special election. We also heard that vote centers could help give state election officials flexibility in conducting an election on short notice. These are locations where ballots for all precincts in a local jurisdiction are available to all voters so that they can vote at any center of their choosing. In closing, we are continuing our review of these topics, and we plan to issue a final report in the coming months. This concludes my prepared statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions members may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gambler. We'll now open it up for questions with the witnesses, beginning with myself and followed by Ranking Member Kilmer, and then we will alternate between members. Any member wishing to be recognized should signal to the chair their interest in asking a question. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start, Ms. Gambler, the GAO report that was presented preliminary was eye-opening, to say the least. recognizing that there are states that didn't even know that this 49-day requirement existed, and the vast majority of states being unable to meet that requirement. I want to talk about, there are 9 states that have met the requirement. Can you talk a little bit about what they have done to ensure that they are meeting the federal regulations that have been put forward? Are there special things that they did, any of them individually?
Sure, thank you for the question, Chairwoman. So as I mentioned, there are 9 states that we've preliminarily identified have integrated aspects of the federal law to USC 8B into their state law. And many of those 9 states have incorporated that time frame provision, the 49-day time frame provision. But some of the states also incorporated other aspects of the law related to, example, transmission of ballots for military and overseas voters, as well as what is specified in 2 USC 8B regarding candidate selection. So there's a little bit of variability across the 9 states, but there are 9 states that address some aspect of the provision of federal law that we're talking about in their state laws.
With so many states either not having knowledge of the federal law or not adhering to it, what is the GAO doing to educate those states or encourage them to consider making changes to meet the 49-day requirement?
Sure, absolutely. So one step we've taken, I've mentioned in my oral statement, is we have sent a survey to election officials in all 50 states to get their perspectives on both the challenges that they might face in holding a special election.
We've only received 27 responses back, is that right?
We've received 27 responses thus far, and we will be continuing our work in this area, going forward. And so we're hopeful, at least on our part, that our work in this area can help with that awareness piece.
Are you aware if any engagement by the Election Assistance Commission in doing some education and outreach on this law? Is that something you may have discussed with them?
Sure, we did meet with the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, regarding our review, and certainly the EAC is a federal entity whose mission is to provide resources to the election community, to states and local election jurisdictions, to help address all aspects of election administration, and certainly this could be an area for the EAC to help provide resources on.
Thank you. Mr. Wickham, do you remember why the House has proposed temporary joint committee to study continuity issues and make recommendations, which was considered and passed in the House in 2003, didn't get any traction in the Senate?
I don't recall that specifically with regard to that piece of legislation. It has been challenging in the past to schedule joint exercises, joint continuity exercises in the past, because of the different schedules of the bodies, the different makeups of the bodies, and different plans for continuity. So it is not confined to that one specific piece of legislation, but joint efforts have been difficult.
Do you think it potentially could be because the Senate does have a continuity plan in place in a different manner, and it may not be as important to them to actually address this issue as it is for the House? Could that be one reason?
It certainly could be one reason, and both houses could have in place their own plans that they are confident in their feasibility.
Do you see that idea, which the Select Committee recommended, as a punt or perhaps a potential way to examine these issues comprehensively? We haven't pushed forward with a constitutional amendment on this issue, more of an examination, but do you feel like that we're sort of abdicating the responsibilities?
No, I think it's the latter, that both bodies could benefit from a fresh review of these circumstances. As I said, the intensity following 9/11 was quite strong, and we worked 6 months with great intensity, and a similar review with heightened intensity would benefit both houses.
Thank you. I recognize Ranking Member Kilmer for 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Wickham, I'm going to stick with you. You heard Dr. Wenstrup's testimony about his concerns about either a mass casualty incident or an incident affecting a smaller number of members, but big enough to flip a majority. Looking back 20 years now with hindsight, do you feel that the solutions that were offered back then fix the problem? Do you think they are sufficient both operationally and constitutionally?
The House, from a procedural perspective, judges the sufficiency in terms of the Constitution by its debate and its vote on a specific rules change. And in this case, that was the determination after 9/11 to put in place the quorum rules change, and has been subsequently adopted. And so there is a notion of advisability that comes with those individual votes. But as I just said, it would behoove both the House and Senate to look at all their procedures and rules to deal with the changes in circumstances, especially the issue of increased political violence.
I mean, one thing I'm struck by is, you know, you hear Ms. Gambler's comment, even if the states could do a special election 49 days, 49 days is a long time in the face of a national crisis. You know, and you could reset the quorum. We pulled up from James Madison's notes, the initial requirement that a majority constitute a quorum to do business was because, and this was his quote, it would be a pleasing ground of confidence to the people that no law or burden could be imposed on them by a few men. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution sets out 3 basic requirements for the House, including that it consist of elected representatives that meet age, citizenship, and residency requirements, and that representatives be apportioned among the states based on their populations. So that makes it hard for me to accept that a House comprised of a much smaller number that may have an entire state without representation would be fitting under the founder's vision. Would you agree with that?
I would just say that you are not alone in your concerns. From the very outset, the reason why the quorum change was not dealt with by the initial Cox-Frost task force was the challenges, the concerns about its constitutionality, one, and then second, about where the line would be drawn with regard to the amount of members that would carry on the House in the event of a catastrophic condition. And this has been raised by a number of internal actors, members of the House, such as your predecessor, Mr. Baird, as well as outside groups. So those are concerns that a number of parties have raised and ones that were considered by that Cox-Frost task force.
Mr. Petersen, I'm hoping you can weigh in here, you know, because you've studied this issue, you've talked to other experts on this topic. What are the biggest concerns that experts have raised about Congress's ability to function in either the circumstance of a mass casualty event or in a circumstance where fewer members are killed or die, but in a way that might flip a majority? What are we hearing from experts on this?
The question of switching majorities is relatively new in the continuity space. It is relatively new in terms of public consideration. I will say that since about 2001, I've been getting questions from congressional offices wondering what happens if a member, enough members change to change the majority. In practice, we don't have a lot of precedent. We have conjecture of variable quality, and it is probably one of those things that needs to be considered more systematically. If you could remind me of the first part of your question.
Just the potential either for a mass casualty event or flipping a majority.
So the potential for a mass casualty event, I has grown as an idea from something where lots of members are dead or injured or incapacitated, to one where just a few are, and it's critical because the majorities are narrow, because it's difficult to have a vote, and things like this. There isn't anything greatly systematic in that discussion beyond the idea that it's a potential problem, but we don't know the boundaries of it. And it is governed in part by how robust majorities have or haven't been in the past several years, but still no decision because we haven't gotten to a point where
Mr. Petersen, if we could just try to wrap up, you're over time here, so we want to be mindful of that.
I'm done. Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bice and Ranking Member Kilmer, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing today. Ensuring the continuity of Congress in a time of crisis is a sobering but critical task for us. In contrast to the Senate, as we've discussed today, the Constitution requires the House vacancies to be filled through special elections, thereby ensuring that the people decide who their elected representatives are. As chair of the Subcommittee on Elections, I am interested in ensuring that states are equipped and prepared to smoothly and expeditiously fill House vacancies through special elections in the event of the unthinkable. Ms. Gambler, I would like to return to your testimony. Thank you for the preliminary insights that you have shared with us from the GAO's ongoing review of state capabilities for holding special elections for House vacancies. I'd like to go back to the input that you got from the survey from state elections officials. 9 states have passed laws concerning special elections that mirror the federal 49-day requirement, but it sounds like some of the states have been more successful there than others. Would you elaborate a little bit more on the types of procedures that the 9 states who do mirror federal law have adopted? What aspects of those laws have they been able to successfully implement?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Thank you for the question. So there's a little bit of variation across those 9 states, but generally most of them have adopted into their state laws provisions addressing the 49-day time frame that's specified into USC 8B. A few of the states have also addressed other aspects of 2 USC 8B, which is the federal law we're talking about, and those include provisions related to the candidate selection process and the transmission of ballots for military and overseas voters.
So if you would, share with us the candidate selection process and how they've modified qualifying. You touched in your statement earlier on using political parties to help identify who the candidates are going to be. Elaborate for us on how that candidate qualifying process has been adjusted in these 9 states so that they can meet the 49-day timeline.
Yes, thank you for the question. We haven't looked in detail at what the specific procedures would be for candidate selection in those 9 states in particular. But what I can say is that for some of those 9 states, they have particularly adopted the timeframes that are specified in the federal law that we're discussing related to identifying candidates. So it's really the timeframe piece that we're speaking about.
And the other thing that you brought up specifically is the UOCAVA, our overseas voters, our overseas military voters. There are also provisions in federal law that tell elections officials when those ballots need to be mailed, how long they need to be out there. Did you discover that some of those provisions are inconsistent with a requirement that we fill these seats in 49 days?
Yes, thank you. I think that's an important point. So there are differences in the timeframes for the transmission of ballots to military and overseas voters between what's specified into USC 8B and what's in UOCAVA. 2 USC 8B specifies that states are to transmit to the greatest extent practicable ballots to military and overseas citizens voters within 15 days of Speaker's announcements. In comparison, in UOCAVA, the requirement is to transmit those absentee ballots within 45 days of Election Day. So there is a difference there between those two federal requirements, and we did hear from the state election officials that responded to our survey that that could be a point of challenge for them in holding a special election.
You also mentioned some of the procurement and logistics issues that were raised in these surveys related to ballot preparation, ballot printing. Can you share with us a little bit more about the other logistical challenges that were identified for you?
Absolutely. So there is, of course, a relationship between candidate selection and ballot preparation. We heard in doing our work that the selection of candidates is obviously important so that ballots can then be printed and prepared. And we did hear from states that it could be challenging to prepare and print ballots on a compressed time frame because of what their existing state laws and procedures are related to ballot preparation, but then also issues related to things like the availability of ballot paper stock, which is used for ballots. So that was an area of concern identified as well.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. And at this time, I recognize Mr. Kilmer for 5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, Mr. Carey for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, both Irish names, I guess, right? Mr. Wickham, you're obviously still with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Yes, sir.
Well, I know you have a new colleague there, Rodney Davis.
Yes, sir.
And tell him the next time that the Chamber comes before the committee, we welcome him back to this committee. We'd love to have him here.
I'm sure he would love that also.
I'm not sure about that, but because you have been in the position to advise members in the past, and what advice would you give to members? And I would ask the same thing from Rodney, but what advice would you give to members who want to move on this issue and do it? What can we be doing to get other members excited about understanding about this issue? This is not an issue that, believe me, I'm not letting my 5-year-old know that we're talking about this type of stuff. But I mean, how do we convince other members to get on board?
I think some of the basic necessities of, I like to call it just a basic necessity of running one's life.
Yeah.
Having a will, having a plan for contingencies, emergencies. That's one way to appeal to other members. The second is to think about the issue in a way that's larger than themselves, that they are representatives of these constituents, and those constituents deserve to have this part of that representative responsibility filled.
You know, it's something else that I was thinking about as I was listening to everybody testify, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Petersen, I promise you I'm not going to make you speak for 3 minutes on this. But one of the things that I thought about is we're talking about members of Congress, but we all have state legislatures that are kind of in the same boat, and hopefully, this type of legislation can be the model for our state legislative bodies, because, in Ohio, we have a full-time legislature, and very much, this could be the same problem there as well. But one other thing, and this is really for all of you, what are some of the pros and cons of the approach that allows members to be involved in the same way in choosing their own temporary replacements, so should something happen? What do you think, versus an approach where each state simply applies its procedures for temporary replacing them? What do you think are the pros and cons in that? Anybody? If not, I'll have to pick one of you. Why don't we let Mr. Petersen talk?
A pro is that there's some assurance that there's someone back there if the suddenly unavailable member needs replacement. A con is that this person is likely unknown to the electorate in that district, is maybe not fully up to speed if they get here in trying circumstances, and may not be seen as a fully fledged member if they're here by indirect selection as opposed to direct election, and would need to get up to speed fairly quickly with how the institution works. I'm sure all of you have lived the experience of the rather steep learning curve around here. And 1 or 2 members per Congress coming in and enduring that in a non-convening, election, that's okay. 100 or more, you are probably looking at slowing down the institution a bit.
You know, and I will tell you, I mean, as somebody that won a special election in a very short time frame and then had to live through redistricting and had to represent 75% different constituency than I represented in the first time I ran for office, there is a challenge to get out there and meet the voters, and I do. But anybody else, pros or cons? I only have 16 seconds, so if not, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. And at this time, I recognize Mr. Timmons, the former ranking member of the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I appreciate you letting me wave on, especially since I wasn't here at the beginning. My team has prepared a remarkably good thing for me to read, and I'm not going to read any of it. We've been working on this for years, and I guess my first question to each of you is, do you believe that a constitutional amendment is necessary to fully address the shortcomings of the current preparation the House has regarding continuity of Congress? Let's start with Ms. Gambler.
Thank you for the question. GAO, within the scope of our current review, hasn't looked at this issue more broadly, but what we would say is that we hope our preliminary observations as well as our ongoing work can help inform Congress as you consider this issue.
I anticipated that. Mr. Wickham?
I would just say that the constitutional amendment would provide the certainty in an area that has been filled with debate from its very beginning with regard to the quorum rule.
I'm unaware of an alternative solution. I tried to come up with some, and they involved court challenges to test untested theories, but at the end of the day, it seems that this is the only solution in my mind. Can you come up with a different solution to address our shortcomings as it relates to reconstituting Congress in the case of a mass casualty event? Or is constitutional amendment arguably the only path forward?
I wouldn't say it's the only path forward. As my predecessor, Mr. Johnson, advised, that it's better, at least preferable, to have a response in place in advance of a crisis, and that a more long-term solution with greater certainty, such as a constitutional amendment, could also be worked on at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Petersen, do you believe a constitutional amendment is necessary to address this challenge?
CRS doesn't take a position on that. What I would suggest is that a constitutional amendment that focuses only on vacancies, that is, members who have expired and are subject to special election, may not be sufficient if it does not include consideration for missing and incapacitated members and some kind of policy and procedure for addressing those absences that may impair the quorum just as strongly as vacancies.
So my friend, Ranking Member Kilmer, and I worked on this at length, and we worked with Congressman Cleaver and Congressman Wenstrup, and we have provided what we believe is, it threads the needle to address the concerns in a temporary basis, and it, if adopted, would solve this problem. Maybe there's other ways to do it, but, you know, a lot of things that we talked about was just the uncertainty surrounding this issue in and of itself creates an incentive structure. You know, we live in crazy times. President Trump has been attempted to be assassinated twice, and I just heard reports that they found explosives at his rally. I mean, you know, this is getting out of hand, and obviously Leader Scalise knows as well as anybody that political violence can change Congress severely. So I do think this is something that we need to take seriously and address. Mr. Wickham, do you believe that the constitutional amendment as proposed would remove the uncertainty surrounding this and create a pathway to resolving should such chaos ever occur?
The two issues that were present from the very beginning were the constitutional arguments against the provisional quorum rule and the legitimacy that came from operating with less than a quorum, perhaps some have argued a very small number. And a constitutional amendment would, by its very nature, through its completion, address that issue, and then after that, it would just be a debate on the merits of the constitutional amendment.
I guess last question, if adopted, functionally, how would it work? You'd get sworn in, and then you would give, who would you give, the clerk's office, the parliamentarian, the list of members to choose from in the event of the triggering circumstances? I guess that's something that had to be worked out.
I will leave that to my successor, Mr. Smith, and his team.
Fair enough. Well, I appreciate y'all taking your time to come and discuss this very important issue. And Madam Chairman, I appreciate you letting me wave on. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I want to say thank you for the witnesses for being with us this afternoon to discuss what I think is an incredibly important topic. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask that if you are provided those, you please respond in writing to those questions. If there is no further business, I thank the members for their participation this afternoon, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.